Tonight I want to talk about something that a lot of people miss, not because it's difficult to notice, but because people with avoidant patterns have gotten really good at acting like it isn't happening. Here's what I've learned. When avoidants believe they've won the emotional battle by pushing empaths into silence, that's exactly when their world starts falling apart underneath them. The connection between an avoidant person and an empath is basically built on opposition. One person feels everything deeply and works through those emotions, while the other buries what they feel and won't let it rise to the surface. One is always chasing closeness and wants to be understood, while the other pulls back, looking for safety and distance. At first, it can seem almost like a perfect match, like two mismatched puzzle pieces somehow clicking together, but over time, this tension turns into something that hurts. The empath gives endless patience, shows compassion, and tries to love the fear right out of the other person. Meanwhile, the avoidant partner draws further inward, pushes away closeness, and hides behind coldness like its armor. This goes on until something finally breaks. The true downfall for the avoidant starts the moment the empath stops giving their emotional energy to the relationship, because what the avoidant believed they had command over was never really theirs to hold on to in the first place. It was only staying together because of a dynamic they never fully understood. Avoidants aren't really handling relationships well at all. They're escaping their emotions, and they could only keep escaping because someone else was standing there, absorbing the impact of their withdrawal. That empath's love, their patience, their constant forgiveness, and their steady presence acted like a buffer, softening the avoidant from ever having to face the real fallout of shutting people out. As long as the empath kept giving, the avoidant never had to look at the emptiness sitting inside them. They never had to deal with their own fears, the wounds they kept tucked away, or the emotional weight they'd locked behind their walls. Picture it like this. For someone avoidant, the empath's emotional presence works like the air around them. They'd never say it out loud, but it's what keeps them steady. It lets them feel important without ever having to risk being vulnerable. It gives them comfort they never had to earn through giving something back. They get to matter without putting anything in. The empath gave far more than affection. They gave a kind of understanding that created real safety. They handed out forgiveness without demanding change, patience with no strings attached, and a steadiness that never wavered. The avoidant took all of it for granted, like it was just the natural order of things. They assumed the empath would always stick around. They never once stopped to ask if this could actually run out. Then something changes. A turning point arrives that nobody sees coming. The empath goes quiet, not out of spite, not out of resentment, not trying to punish anyone through anger, just quiet. This silence comes from exhaustion, not rage. It's the kind of quiet that gently says something the avoidant never thought they'd hear. I'm too worn out to keep holding both of our feelings by myself. That's the moment everything starts to come apart for the avoidant. They finally understand that the foundation they thought they'd built was never really under their control. They were leaning entirely on someone else's energy, someone else's choice to keep showing up. Once that emotional fuel from the empath disappears, there's nothing left to keep them standing. The avoidant breaks down because they were never truly self-sufficient. They only looked stable because another person kept working behind the scenes to hold everything up. In that silence, the avoidant is forced to face the exact thing they'd been running from all along, themselves, stripped bare, with no one left to soften the blow. In the early days of that silence, the avoidant doesn't fully grasp what's happening. They tell themselves it's just a phase, a bit of distance before things go back to how they were. They're convinced the empath will come back around, the way they always have, and that the emotional warmth will return like nothing happened. But time keeps moving, and something strange starts to settle in, a feeling they can't quite put into words. The ground under them feels shaky. The whole system that kept them emotionally grounded, the one built and maintained by the empath, begins to crumble. This is where the real breakdown starts, not out in the open, but quietly, deep inside where no one else can witness it. Avoidants have convinced themselves that their strength comes from staying distant. They've trained themselves to think being shut off means being strong. They've linked hiding their feelings with being safe. They've treated emotional walls as a form of control. But once the empath pulls away, everything flips. That distance they used to prize turns into loneliness. That sense of safety becomes emptiness. That armor they spent years building becomes the very thing that destroys them, because now they're facing something totally new, having no one left to emotionally lean on. The empath's warmth isn't there anymore to soften their fear. The empath's understanding isn't there to cushion their harsh edges. The empath's presence isn't filling the empty spaces they always refused to admit were there. And suddenly the avoidant is standing face to face with everything they'd spent years running from. Doubts about who they are, insecurities they buried deep, old wounds from the past, a craving for connection they always denied having, and a fear of being abandoned. It all rises up with nowhere left to hide. The walls they built start collapsing under the weight of emotions they never learned how to handle. But this collapse happens quietly. It unfolds without noise. In that stillness, the avoidant starts to notice something they'd overlooked. The empath is really gone. They feel the loss of the closeness they used to brush off as unnecessary. They catch themselves missing the very thing they swore they never wanted. Regret starts creeping in, because the silence leaves them no choice but to face what they'd been avoiding this whole time. The truth lands differently now. The empath's love wasn't endless like they had assumed. They never actually had the control they believed they did. Keeping their distance didn't protect them from pain, it only pushed the pain further down the road. And now the outcome is impossible to ignore. The avoidant falls apart because they've lost the emotional support they leaned on. They break because the silence forces the truth out into the open. They crumble once they realize that what the empath gave them was never something to resent. It was actually the thing holding everything together. Without it, they finally feel the full weight of what they turned away. This breakdown isn't really about losing the empath as a person. It's about losing the emotional groundwork the empath had been quietly building all along. It's about losing that feeling of being cherished and looked after without ever having to give anything back in return. The moment the empath stops supplying that emotional fuel, the avoidant's inner world starts to break apart, because they're finally experiencing the very thing they'd spent their whole life dodging: raw, unfiltered emotion with nothing standing in the way. The avoidant always confused silence with strength, right up until the moment the empath found her own version of silence. For someone with avoidant tendencies, quiet acts like a stronghold. It's their way of protecting themselves, their method for managing the storm inside, their exit whenever emotions start feeling like too much. They retreat into stillness the way other people might seek comfort somewhere safe. For them, going quiet isn't about getting back at someone or nursing hurt feelings. It's a way to survive. They disappear into it to calm their nervous system, to escape feelings they don't fully understand, and to avoid the vulnerability that real closeness demands. In their mind, silence means power. It makes them feel like they're in charge of their emotional world, like they're the ones setting the pace, like they're controlling how quickly things move forward. Pulling back into silence lets them dodge the exposure that comes with true intimacy. And it works because the empath fills the space the avoidant leaves behind. The empath speaks love into that quiet. She offers reassurance. She leans in instead of stepping back. Every time the avoidant retreats, she moves closer. Every time the avoidant shuts down, she fills the gap with her own words of care. This pattern teaches the avoidant that silence has no price to pay. They come to believe that pulling away only makes them stronger. They assume the relationship can go on forever this way, since the empath will always be the one carrying the emotional load. But then everything changes in a way the avoidant never saw coming. The empath finally stops talking. She steps into her own silence. And this doesn't come from a lack of love or a wish to cause pain. It comes from something far deeper than that. Her own well of energy has finally run completely dry. Empaths don't go quiet for no reason. They fall silent once they've worn themselves out speaking to someone who never actually hears them. They pull back once they realize their words just keep hitting a wall and bouncing off. They stop when caring starts to feel like it's tearing them down instead of building anything up. Once the empath reaches her own version of silence, everything the avoidant thought they knew about themselves crumbles. That silence no longer feels like a safe place to hide. It becomes something frightening instead. What used to feel like power now feels like helplessness. The calm that once comforted them suddenly feels heavy, like a weight sitting on their chest. They start to feel something they've spent their whole life avoiding: real, emotional fear. And here's what makes this moment so different. The empath's silence isn't empty or accidental. It's full of purpose, firm boundaries, and hard truth. It says something the avoidant never expected to hear. I'm done chasing. I've poured out everything I had left. This distance belongs to me now, not something you're forcing on me. In that instant, the avoidant finally sees something that turns their whole sense of self upside down. Their silence was never actual strength. It was fear dressed up as control. The truth becomes impossible to escape. They had been completely dependent on the empath's willingness to keep showing up. They counted on her ability to forgive, to keep bouncing back, to close every distance between them. Now, with no one there to fill the space with warmth, comfort, reassurance, and love, the avoidant is left with nothing standing between them and their own inner world. That silence they once treated like a shield turns into a mirror showing them just how alone they really are. The avoidant falls apart because the empath pulling away reveals something they've spent a lifetime refusing to admit. They never truly mastered emotional distance. They simply had someone who was willing to close every gap they created. Without her there to smooth things over, the avoidant is finally forced to meet what they've been running from: fear of abandonment, deep-rooted insecurity, that painful hunger for connection, and regret that cuts far deeper than any fight ever could. The silence feels almost unbearably loud, louder than every argument they avoided, louder than every feeling they buried, louder than the distance they built on purpose. It feels this loud because, for the first time, they're not the one controlling it. They could manage their own withdrawal, but they can't manage hers. That loss of control triggers their deepest fear, the real possibility that someone who meant the world to them might actually be gone for good. For years, the avoidant held on to the idea that their silence was a sign of strength, but the empath pulling away shows them something completely different. The true strength belonged to the one who kept showing up anyway, who kept offering love, who kept reaching out despite everything. Real strength lives in being open, not in hiding behind walls. When the empath stops giving herself to the relationship, the avoidant is forced to face a truth they worked hard to avoid. Their silence never protected what they had. It slowly tore it apart piece by piece. That same silence they used as protection now cuts straight through their defenses, because once the empath finally goes quiet, the avoidant learns something they never expected. What they thought was strength was never strength at all. It was anxiety wearing a disguise. The breaking point comes when they finally understand that silence isn't control, especially when it comes from the one person who loved them the most. Silence usually feels like absence to them, but this time it's their own absence they're feeling. The empath's stillness opens up a space the avoidant never wanted to step into. That silence pushes them toward the one place they've avoided their entire life, actually looking at what's happening inside them. People with avoidant patterns have basically built their whole emotional world around escaping pain. They learn to cope by shutting down, going numb, pulling away, cutting themselves off from anything that feels too heavy or asks for real closeness. This didn't happen by chance. It was shaped in their earliest years, deepened by wounds they never worked through and carried into adulthood like an invisible suit of armor. They keep running from feelings that seem foreign, threatening, or just too much to handle, because looking straight at them feels like stepping into fire. The empath's constant effort, her talking things through, her explaining, her love, her forgiveness, her attempts to hold the relationship together gave the avoidant somewhere to hide. As long as she kept filling that emotional space, he never had to look inward. He never faced the fears and self-doubt buried under his walls. He could keep making excuses, keep justifying, keep defending himself, because her emotional effort held the whole thing up. Everything changes the moment she goes quiet. Suddenly, there's nowhere left for him to hide. The distractions disappear. Her voice is gone. That comforting presence vanishes. The soothing that used to hide the damage from his withdrawal is no longer there. All the excuses, the emotional cushioning, the forgiving energy, all of it is gone. With nothing left to reflect his feelings back at him, the avoidant is finally forced into a reckoning he never prepared for, a confrontation with himself, with his deepest fears, with the wounds he's kept sealed away, with the self-doubt he spent years outrunning, and with the sobering truth that he was never as unaffected as he pretended to be. Here's the real truth underneath all of it. Avoidants are more afraid of what's happening inside themselves than they are of a relationship actually ending. That's exactly why they run. That's why they pull away. That's why they shut down the second things start feeling real. Turning inward means facing the parts of themselves that never felt cherished, never felt protected, never felt valued, never felt like enough. It means confronting the deep belief that real connection isn't something they deserve. That opening up is dangerous. That letting someone get close always ends in being left behind. These aren't small worries sitting on the surface. They're core beliefs built during the years when their emotional safety was first broken. Facing them isn't just uncomfortable, it feels like their whole world is at stake. As long as the empath stayed close, offering warmth, understanding, tenderness, and real connection, the avoidant could keep avoiding all of this inner work. They borrowed her emotional strength and used it as their own shield. But true silence brings everything hidden out into the light. It shows the emptiness they've been guarding so carefully. It reveals just how hollow their emotional escape really was. It forces them to finally feel what they've been running from since they were children. Inside that silence, feelings rise up that they are nowhere near ready for. Fear, loneliness, shame, a desperate longing, deep regret, confusion, a sense of being abandoned, old wounds they never let themselves acknowledge. It all comes crashing down at once because they never learned how to process emotion in a healthy way. They relied on the empath to hold the emotional balance, to keep the relationship steady, to stop everything from falling apart, to keep some sense of wholeness intact. Without her there, the avoidant is left drowning in a flood of his own unprocessed emotions. That silence becomes a mirror showing exactly who they are and what they've done. It reveals the emotional coldness they handed out. It exposes the disconnection they created on purpose. It shows the damage they caused. And most of all, it reflects a truth they can't escape. They pushed away the one person who truly saw them, who truly understood them, who accepted them completely, and who gave them real love. This hits with a rare kind of force because avoidants usually find it hard to offer themselves any forgiveness. Even though they don't show emotion the way empaths do, on the inside they're feeling everything, a delayed and overwhelming wave that eventually crashes down with full force. As the empath sinks into her own silence, the avoidant's usual defenses start to break down completely. Avoidance as a strategy no longer brings any comfort. Keeping busy no longer numbs the pain. Making excuses no longer makes any sense. They can't point to the empath's emotional intensity anymore because there's nothing coming from her side at all now. They can't claim they need space because this kind of space doesn't feel like freedom, it feels like punishment. They can't celebrate their independence because this kind of alone feels like real abandonment. In that stillness, something important becomes crystal clear. They were never actually running from the empath. They were running from their own ability to feel deeply and be truly seen. Now that emotional truth has finally caught up with them, the silence uncovers the emotional immaturity that was hiding under their calm exterior. It shows what happens when someone chooses self-protection over real closeness. It reveals just how much they actually cared, how much that connection meant, and how badly their withdrawal wrecked the very thing they secretly wanted, but never had the tools to accept. This inner struggle marks the start of their unraveling. It happens quietly. There are no big blow-ups or angry scenes. It plays out in the privacy of their own mind, in the quiet moments alone with their thoughts, sitting with regret, wrestling with anxiety, carrying guilt, and finally recognizing the emotional needs that were never met. For someone whose whole identity is built on avoiding emotional truth, this kind of reckoning feels like the end of the world. They come to understand something basic. The empath's love was the thing keeping them steady all along, whether or not they'd ever admit it. Without that anchor, the avoidant is left drifting, facing everything they've dodged for years. This is exactly why the empath's silence is what breaks the avoidant down. Silence doesn't just take her voice away, it takes away every excuse they were leaning on. Once those excuses vanish, they're finally forced into something they've avoided their whole life, an honest look at themselves. The avoidant expected to be chaste. They never expected real, peaceful stillness. That calm, quiet withdrawal is exactly what shatters the identity they'd built to protect themselves. Avoidants live inside a mindset where they assume the emotional imbalance will always tip in their favor. They've come to expect being wanted, forgiven, comforted, supported, and put first emotionally. They've grown used to the empath's familiar rhythm, coming back after they pull away, trying to repair things, explaining herself, offering the warmth that keeps everything from falling apart. To them, this doesn't feel like manipulation. It's just how the relationship always worked. Pull back and someone comes closer, shut down and someone stays anyway. This pattern gives them a false sense of power and stability. Being chaste lets them feel valued without ever having to open themselves up. So when the avoidant creates distance, they're fully convinced the empath will respond the way she always has. They expect emotion, deep conversations, desperate attempts to close the gap, pleading for understanding, or at least some effort to reconnect. In their mind, this is simply how love works. The avoidant pulls away. The other person tries harder. It's the familiar cycle that gives them a sense of security. It convinces them they can stay connected without ever really investing themselves. Then something happens that they never saw coming. The one thing the avoidant never prepared for actually takes place. The empath stops chasing. She doesn't cry, over-explain, demand answers, or try to save things from inside the silence. She simply stops. Instead, she settles into a calm kind of absence. They've built up this belief that the empath will always forgive, always give more of herself, always offer more than she probably should. They tell themselves that unconditional love means she'll put up with almost anything forever. But the empath's love was never limitless. It was just remarkably generous, and every kind of generosity eventually reaches its limit. A limit the avoidant never truly believed he'd see until the day she stopped making excuses for his distance.